Okay, here we go. Focus. Speed. I am speed. One winner. 42 losers. I eat losers for breakfast. Breakfast? Maybe I should have had breakfast. A little brekkie could be good for me. No, stay focused. Speed. I'm faster than fast, quicker than quick. I am lightning.
Hey, Lightning, you ready?
I'm American-made, but like Chevrolet. My mama taught me wrong from right. I was born in the South. Sometimes I have a big mouth when I see something that I don't like. I gotta say it. We've been driving this road for a mighty long time, paying no mind to the signs. Well, this neighborhood's changed, it's all been rearranged. We left that team somewhere behind. Slow down, we're gonna crash. Baby, you were screaming, it's a blast, blast, blast. Look out, baby, got your gorgeous on.
Alright, we're just gonna do this. Christie Suspension, a revolutionary work of genius engineering that forever changed the way we design tanks. Or so we've been told. Its most famous use being in the Soviet BT series, but Christie Suspension's influence on the ever-complex engineering of armored vehicles expands beyond the Soviets, and the BTs are far from the only tanks to use the design. I've actually been interested in Christie Suspension for quite a while now. In fact, this was supposed to be the video I was going to make after my first tank documentary on the Tiger. Going into this video, there were a few key questions and points I wanted to clear up with my research, but I quickly found myself sliding down a deep rabbit hole, and where I originally wanted to answer just a few simple questions, I've ended up as an expert on the subject matter of Christie Suspension, for better or for worse. Now, I'm not going to pretend this is the reason this video took so long to come out, I'm just really lazy. I'll try my best to be as specific and detailed as possible, but I'm not trying to make another 40-minute monster here to save both myself and you guys. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this. As with all good stories, ours begins with a man, Walter J. Christie. Now, Christie was a bit of an eccentric, and had been in the automotive industry for quite some time as a rather proud figure, always coming out with wacky yet revolutionary designs. He was definitely a genius, but the man was also way too full of himself. But it wasn't until World War I that Christie would dip his toes into tankery. Although I really shouldn't call it that. Most of what Christie worked on at this time were simply race cars with guns mounted to them, not even really utilizing Christie suspension as we know it. These early tanks did however retain the ability to drive without their tracks, something Christie tanks would later be famous for. After World War I, Christie slithered back to his lair and awaited the next moment to grace the world with his presence. Until then though, the United States continued tank development without him. Many different companies received contracts from the military for new tank designs, with one being Rock Island Arsenal and a man named Harry Knox. Knox came to the military with a stunning new tank, designated the medium tank T1. This little number made quite the splash in the scene when it debuted, and the military was quite impressed with what the tank offered. In addition to the introduction of the capable light tank T1, it looked like the United States was finally going to have its very own domestically produced tanks. Until, from the depths, the darkest corners of the earth, a rumble was felt worldwide as the man himself awoke once more, with a new tank. The M1928. If the military thought the T1 and the T1 were impressive, this thing was crazy good. The tank had a number of incredible features that put it leagues above anything else the US had. A convertible track-to-wheel drive system, and the layout of the tank was the optimal system we've come to expect today. Crew in the front, engine in the back. Namely though, was its speed. This tank was fast. really fast, like 70 miles per hour on its wheels fast, and Christie, being the eccentric that he was, even referred to the tank as the M1940, implying the design was 12 years ahead of its time. The military, however, continued to call it the 1928. Needless to say, the tank threw a real wrench in the gears of the T1 and the T1. It made its unofficial debut at Virginia in Fort Meade, I don't know how to say that, and after an impressive showing, the military requested a more in-depth test of the tank, on Christie's dime. He agreed, and so the military put it through far tougher tests than they would their own tanks. However, the 1928 continued to outperform its competitors. Even with the tidal wave of a splash the M1928 made at the time of its debut, the tank itself had a few flaws. Despite how it may seem, Christie was not a wealthy man, and while he more often than not had great designs, the constructions of his vehicles always left a little to be desired. The armor was way too thin, the turret was non-existent, and the internal workings of the tank itself were less than superb. And during its testing, it needed to be pulled aside several times for repairs and parts replacements. Even still, it was light years ahead of the T1 and the T1. Despite how easy the decision now seemed, the military still had a lot of trouble making up its mind on which designs to accept. The US wasn't exactly flush with cash, and the sums Christie was asking for his tanks were a little high for what they were willing to pay. There was a lot of internal bickering in ordnance, especially after some new appointments in 1930. The big guys in office didn't like the idea of blindly purchasing droves of Christie tanks without further testing, and Christie himself had a lot to say on the matter. The process of bringing Christie's tanks into service was dragged through the mud. So, Christie began to look for buyers elsewhere. He started in Poland, as you do, and managed to strike a deal with the Polish for one Christie tank. He also poked around with the Soviets. Now, Christie himself wasn't exactly the Soviet Union's biggest fan, and the Soviet Union wasn't his either, but the Soviets were impressed by the debut of the 1928 and wanted to purchase 2 tanks from him, as well as production rights and patents. Christie agreed, and along with the contract he signed with Poland, it seemed like he wasn't going to need the United States after all. Real quick, there is a common misconception that Christie's dealings with the Soviets had to be kept under wraps, and that he even sent the tanks to the Soviets labeled as tractors, as to not raise suspicion. This isn't true. Although US-Soviet relations weren't anywhere to be excited about, they definitely weren't as bad as they would be later in the century. Christie's little Soviet supply mission was well known by the United States government, but at the end of the day, there just wasn't really much they could do to stop him. The United States and Christie continued to bicker about how to go about the adoption of the new tank, and eventually Christie was given the specifications for an M1931 tank based on his design. Christie threw back his own specifications that he thought would be better, and they went back and forth on this until a consensus was reached. He delivered the 1931 to the military, missing its turret and a few other parts that they were promised. Needless to say, the military was less than ecstatic, but the tank was still good enough that Christie received the contract to produce 7 more tanks for testing, for both the infantry and the cavalry. Now this is where things get a little complicated, so listen up. Before the cavalry was converted to armored regiments, the infantry and the cavalry had different naming schemes for tanks. The cavalry called them combat cars, while infantry called them light or medium tanks. As such, a tank that was tested by both the cavalry and the infantry had 2 different names. This caused me a huge headache when researching for this video, but I'll try to keep it simple for you all here. Infantry and cavalry both purchased 1931s, where they received the designations Medium Tank T3 by the infantry and Combat Car T1 by the cavalry. Infantry tested them against the Medium Tank T1E1 and the Medium Tank T2, where Christie T3 once again outperformed. The cavalry made their own modifications to their versions of Christie tanks and tested them themselves, and by the end of it all, both the cavalry and infantry were interested in standardizing the tank. However, the ordnance branch didn't agree. Even amongst the tank's impressive performance, cavalry complaints of cramped crew space, too small of a turret, and too much weight were enough to convince ordnance the tank needed further modification before it could be accepted into service. There was one problem, however: money. The big SAD is now in full swing, and the development of both the 1928 and the M1931 had put Christie in debt, and the small contracts he had made so far with the Soviet Union and Poland weren't enough to get him out. As such, his demands to the military for his contract commanded way more money than the military was willing to give. This is probably a good time to mention, Christie had already sold the patents and rights to his designs to the US military. In fact, not only did they have the rights to every tank he had ever built, but also every tank he had yet to build. With this knowledge in mind, the solution to this financial conundrum was quite simple: ditch Christie. The military simply gave production contracts for more medium tank T3s to other companies, such as Rock Island Arsenal and American LaFrance, which is a fire truck manufacturing company previously owned by Christie. Oh, the irony. Now, for the purposes of this video, this is where Christie's story ends. But obviously the man didn't just keel over and die after this point. His story does continue, and I implore anyone out there who wants to learn more about him to go out and do your own research. But we're focused on the suspension for today, and that story is far from over. With Christie out of the picture, the military could now make whatever changes they wanted to his designs, so they took their own crack at making their own tanks with his suspension, and quite a few were made. The first of which came out as the infantry medium tank T3E2. As you can see, it already looks far different from Christie's original T3 design. Infantry had a lot of good ideas, such as a wider front to fit another crewman, a larger turret, and easier engine access for maintenance. But the company contracted to design the thing was a goddamn fire truck manufacturing company with zero previous experience involving armored vehicles. So while they requested a lot of good changes, none of them were ever really implemented correctly, and the vehicle just ended up feeling like a square peg in a round hole for the infantry. The cavalry, on the other hand, had a bit more success. They produced Combat Car T4, which was blatantly then stolen by infantry to create the medium tank T4. This was the all-star design that would make it to the final testing stages, but the T4 had one final boss fight to get through. Harry Knox. That's right, you thought he was gone. All this time, Harry had been scheming hard of a way to defeat Christie once and for all. Now that Christie wasn't even involved in designing his own tank, Knox made his move and introduced the Light Tank T2, or Combat Car T5, with his now patented VVSS suspension. Of course, we always try to avoid spoilers on this channel, but for those of you who have, I don't know, seen a Stuart, you can probably see where this is going. In the final trials, the T4 and the T5 combat cars were sent through a series of tests along with a few other vehicles, and both tanks performed very well. However, the T4 still showed some weaknesses the military wanted to rectify. Thus, it was determined the T4 would need a few more modifications before it was ready to be accepted into service. The military had a decision to make. On one hand, you had the T4, which was expensive and was going to require a few extra modifications before it could begin full production. On the other hand, you had the T5, which was practically equal in performance, but was perfect the way it was and could be mass-produced right away at a cheaper price. The military made their decision. The T5 was redesignated in 1935 as the Light Tank M2A1 and M1 combat car, and would see a series of evolutions over the course of its life that would ultimately lead to the Stuart we've all come to know today. But don't let yourself come to tears quite yet, as the T4 was adopted by the military in 1939 as the convertible medium tank M1, albeit for limited service. That's pretty much as far as Christie Suspension goes in the United States. But as you may remember, Christie had dealings with other countries as well. So let's check in on those countries, shall we? Poland had signed a contract with Christie to receive one Model 1928 from him, and they were very excited to get their hands on it and begin testing. Or at least, I think they were. They never really got the chance to do any real testing with the tank though, as Christie simply never gave it to them. Oops. All was not lost, however, as Polish engineers managed to acquire design notes and reference material from Christie and use them to design the 10TP tank. This tank never left prototyping though, as the 7TP was given production priority. As for the Soviets, well, we all know what the Soviets did. The two NEM 1928s the Soviets purchased from Christie arrived 4 months after the due date set on their contract, missing their turrets and many of the spare parts they specifically requested. The Soviets felt cheated and thus refused to pay $25,000 of the agreed $60,000 for the tanks. Soon after, they cut all ties with Christie and went about designing their own tanks without him. The BT series would become by far the most famous of all tanks based on Christie's designs, and some mixed results. It performed poorly during its combat debut in the Winter War, mostly due to the snow and hostile terrain and, well, the finish.
Venice.
But did decently well when used in its intended role in the Polish campaign and the German invasion in 1941. Christie Suspension would be carried on into the T-34, however would never be seen in any other Soviet designs after. Even the British took an interest in Christie Suspension. They purchased a tank from him after they saw the successful tests in the Soviet BT. In signature Christie style, the tank showed up without a turret and missing a lot of parts. Still, after testing what they had, the British were quite satisfied. Their next contact with Christie went a little something like this.
I want $10 million a year for the rest of my life.
Heaven help me!
So the British cut ties with Christie and went about making their own tanks with his design. This resulted in the famous cruiser series of tanks the British would use for a decent chunk of the war, and as far as I've been able to tell, with the research I've done, the British Comet tank is the last design of World War II to use Christie Suspension as we know it for this video. But if I'm wrong about that, please feel free to correct me in the comments below. So what's the big deal? Is Christie Suspension good or not? Note, for this point forward, I'm going off script, because quite frankly, I've been fucking stuck with writer's block for like 2 weeks, and I really want to get this video out, so I'm just gonna go through my notes, and we're just gonna fucking talk about this like real men. Christie Suspension is just coil spring suspension, but with really, really large springs. This allows for the suspension in the tank to have amazing travel, which is great if you want a tank that needs to go really, really fast. The downside is, the bigger your tank gets, the bigger the springs have to be. And these springs already take up a huge amount of the internal volume of the tank. So really, Christie Suspension is only useful in light tanks. Now you will find people out there who will argue that coil spring suspension is still used in modern tanks like the Macurvita today, but that's coil spring suspension in a much more modern fashion, not really Christie Suspension as we know it for this video. Christie Suspension as we know it for this video are the giant coil springs. Having these really large springs was great for Christie tanks that needed to go really, really fast, and Christie was a huge proprietor of going fast. This was a big point of contention between Christie and the US military. One of the biggest complaints they had with Christie's tanks was simply that they were too lightly armored. The United States was looking for a medium tank, not a light tank, but Christie was hell-bent on building a race car tank essentially. Many of his early designs didn't include turrets, and Christie himself just seemed to not be a fan of turrets. When Christie set his mind to something, he really dove all in on it, such as his flying tank concept in 1932. Christie was obsessed with the idea of just making a race car tank, and a race car just can't have armor if you want the speeds Christie was trying to achieve. Now, by the time the United States developed the T4 combat car and T4 medium tank, yes, it used Christie suspension, but the armor was upped and other things were added such as a heavier turret and more weaponry, so the weight of the tank was so that it wasn't able to go the milestone speeds that the previous 1928 and 1931 Christie tanks could. The Soviets seemed to be the only people who really didn't care about the armor issue. They were definitely on board with fast tank go burr. You can see this in a lot of the testing they did. If you look up old Soviet footage of BT testing, a lot of it involves them jumping these tanks over rivers, which I think was going to end up being a huge concept of the BT. Christie Suspension also famously allowed for tanks to be quote-unquote convertible, which no, not convertible like you're thinking, convertible as in you could take the tracks off and drive on the wheels. Now, the Americans thought this was a pretty cool feature, and they continued to develop it in other tanks like the T7, even after Harry Knox's VVSS suspension designs were picked over the T4 in the final testing stages. The Soviets also were kind of a fan of the technology, and there was definitely evidence to prove that they used it every now and then, but while Christie Suspension was carried over to the T-34, the ability to take off the tracks and drive on road wheels was not. And the answer for this is kind of simple. The whole reason Christie wanted to design tanks that could take their treads off and drive on their road wheels was actually a problem that tanks were having back in World War I. Track life expectancy was extremely short. In World War I, tanks were having to be loaded onto the back of huge flatbed trucks and then driven to the front lines before being unloaded and then sent to battle. Christie's convertible drive system was the solution to that problem. Simply take off the treads, drive it on its road wheels to the front lines, then throw the tracks on, and boom, into battle you go. Now for World War I, when this concept was conceived in the early 1920s, this was revolutionary, and the Americans were really big fans of it. However, by the mid to late 1930s, by the time pretty much any of Christie's tanks actually caught hold anywhere, track life expectancy had significantly increased, and while sure, it was still cool and still useful, it was no longer necessary. These convertible tanks were meant to be driven on their road wheels on, well, roads. If you're going to take the tank off-road, then it should be equipped with tracks. This is a reason why the Soviets didn't necessarily use this feature to its fullest potential. Because think about it, they're driving these tanks in the vast Russian countryside, with not many roads. To put it simply, the Soviets had no real combat environment in which they would need a tank that could drive without its tracks. Thus, when Christie Suspension was carried over to the T-34, the ability to drive without its tracks was not. The British pretty much abandoned the convertible tank idea almost immediately. As far as I know, none of the Cruiser series tanks that they ever built included the ability to drive without its tracks, and the Comet definitely didn't. So, in conclusion, Christie Suspension is good if you're building a light, fast tank, but pretty much anything else, it's not ideal, and at some point you're better off just using torsion bar suspension. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to sit here and explain all the differences between suspension types. That I'm probably going to save for another video. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the history of Christie tanks. My goal with this video was to cover the genesis of Christie Suspension and then follow it along its evolution into every tank that used it. Pretty much every tank we talked about in this video used Christie Suspension. As I said in the beginning, this is a video that I had been wanting to make for quite a while, but just never got around to, and I'm super happy that I was finally able to actually, well, make it and present it to you all. So I really hope this is something you guys enjoyed watching, and as always, I hope you guys learned something. Before I do my final send-off, I just want to give a huge shout out to everybody who watched my Sherman video. That video was by far my most prized possession. It was my magnum opus, and I really put my heart and soul into it, and reading all the nice and amazing comments that people left on that video seriously warmed my heart, and trust me, it is filling me with an absolute drive to do everything I can to make this channel as awesome as possible. I may not be fast, but trust me guys, I'm committed, and I'm going to keep making videos for as long as I possibly can because I really do enjoy this. So as always, if there's any other topics you guys would like to see me cover, let me know in the comments below. I have a huge list of video ideas, so I'm definitely not going to run out anytime soon, but again, feedback is always appreciated. Please make sure, as always, to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and share with your friends too. The best way to get a channel like this that's as new as mine out in the open is to share, so please share, share, share. But that about wraps it up for me, so once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.